How's everyone doing out there? It's myself, Jeff Black, Brandon DeCruz. We're back for episode 55 of Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. Today, we're going to have a topic of called training talk, hypertrophy progression models, exercise order, the mind muscle connection, and blood flow restriction training. We are going to kind of skip our last 7 days and just get into it because we just had about 5 minutes or so of weird technical difficulties that we couldn't explain. That I just literally had to click a different bot. I literally clicked the same damn
You
thing.
had me locked out.
I
No,
don't
no
know.
audio, nothing.
Well, you know
Oh
what? I
man,
just
I'm
wanted to
glad to be on here, my
silence you.
man.
That's all. I just was like, you know what? Peace and quiet for the day. But anyway, nonetheless, we got to go in. So we're going to dive right into this one. So for those of you who don't give a shit about how our last 7 days have been, this is the podcast for you. What is the best progression scheme for hypertrophy, B?
All right, so this is a compilation of questions that I've gotten and I've collected over the last couple episodes. So a lot of the feedback I've been getting from listeners and viewers of the show has been they want a little bit more training talk, but more like in-depth stuff, not just like the benefits like we've covered with resistance training, with cardiovascular conditioning, and things of that sort. So we're going to dive into some more nuanced programming questions and things that we've collected over the last couple of weeks. But when it comes to the question of what the best progression scheme for hypertrophy is and gaining muscle, I think we need to acknowledge why we need progression schemes in the first place. And that's because we need to, we want to be able to utilize something to progress our training essentially. And so we have to acknowledge why that we use progression schemes as well as what different progression schemes are available to use. So the real reason as to why we would use a progression scheme or put one in place into our training is because throughout the course of a training cycle and our training career in general, we need to continue challenging our body to continue to make progress and see the positive adaptations. And using a progression scheme is a way to align our training approach with that requirement. Now, when it comes to progression schemes, there are generally like two progression models that I'll use within my programming. So I'm going to cover how I go about progression models. And then, Jeff, I'm going to let you open up about how you look at progression models, how you implement them with your own clients. So I'll speak on my own perspective or how I go about it. And then, I'll switch the conversation and flip it to you essentially. So within my own program for my clients, I'll generally use the single progression model or the double progression model. So within the single progression model, that's when we manipulate one variable within our training in isolation. So that can be done by like adding reps, or we could be increasing load, or we could be adding sets. So it's one variable or it's one programming change in isolation by itself. And we're only manipulating one to drive progress forward. Now, the next progression model that we can use is double progression. And this is when we progress in reps through a target rep range for all our sets of an exercise until we hit the upper end of this rep range. And once we hit the top end of the rep range for all of our sets, then we will look to go for the double progression. What that means is then we're going to go towards adding load to the exercise. And then we would go back down to the bottom of that target rep range to continue challenging ourselves essentially. So I'll give an example of how using a double progression method would look. So say that I have a client that's doing, say 3 sets of 8 to 10 on an exercise. And on week 1 of the program, they do their sets and their sets look like 10, 9, 8 at 100 pounds. On week 2, I'd have them aim to get, say, 10, 10, 9. So now they've increased 1 rep on 2 of their working sets. So we see a progression within that transition from week 1 of a mesocycle to week 2. Now, on say on week 3 of the training cycle, they hit 3 sets of 10 with 100 pounds. So now they've went from that 10, 9, 8 to 10, 10, 10. And so they've hit the top end of the rep range in all 3 of those sets. So now it's time that we can move forward in terms of a load progression because they've topped out that rep range within the load that they've been using. So because of this, on week 4, we look to increase the load to 105 pounds and aim for them to get at least 8 reps, which is the bottom of that target rep range because we were looking to target 8 to 10 reps. Now, when it comes to the best progression scheme, because this was really the error of the question for building muscle, both are effective progression models, which we can use, but I tend to favor, like personally, utilizing the double progression model. And that's because I tend to work with a lot of intermediate and advanced trainees. And these individuals just can't focus on load progression. So that's one of like the most popular ways that people use single progression model is just to increase load week to week. But really, most of the people that I work with are at a point in their training career where that isn't a realistic progression. Like think about your own training, Jeff. Like how many times are you going through an entire training cycle and linearly increasing load? I'm sure it's not frequent, you know?
Well, I was just thinking, like, I don't really. I guess I came up in, the 90s of bodybuilding and sports and strength and so forth. So
Mhm.
I have always gone on the basis, like, for example, if I get a gym pop client, I will just give them an overall workout that I know is like comprised of compound movements, of isolation movements. I have the rep ranges be anywhere from 10 to 30. And I usually start the sets out around 2 to 3 and assess volume. And some people, you'll find a lot of gym pop people don't really know a rep and reserve, which is why I argue when all these bodybuilding coaches out there try to tell gym pop people who've been doing shit for less than 2 years in the gym what a rep and reserve. I'm like, they don't understand that. Like, you tell any client, like, I have a 73-year-old lady I train, D. She's a beast. Like, she'll literally always be like, oh my God, I can't believe you're making me do it. She just reps it, and I'm just like, but when it comes to like more nuanced, like myself, I build my workouts based upon what I need to progress in. And each week, I usually kind of go off how I feel for the workout volume wise, like meaning I have a minimum threshold, for example, for back of 16 sets that I'll do. And then
Okay.
sometimes if I feel good, I'll work up to 24. My reps can be anywhere from 10 to 20. I go strictly off how I feel at the beginning of the workout. I mix up my exercise order pretty much all the time. And then when it comes to what you were saying, as far as the progressional models of being like, hey, I hit this weight 3 sets in a row, I'm going to go up in the weight next time. I usually will start at a weight heavy where I barely get like the 10 reps. And then my goal is to lose reps as I go through my sets with no less than a certain number. So, meaning if I hit 16 on my first set, I wouldn't go lower than 12 on my last one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're seeing a work drop off. So you're essentially doing like a top set, back off set, essentially,
Correct.
and
And they
maybe with
work down
load,
backwards.
or you're doing it with rep drop off, which could be utilized as well, and that could be done in a double progression manner. Because think about how I described it.
Right.
The first set, if you are taking it to the house, you're generally going to get the most reps because that is when you're freshest and you have accumulated the least amount of fatigue. And from there, we start seeing rep drop off. So, like in the first example I gave, the client was at 3 sets of 8 to 10, but they got
Right.
10, 9, 8. So we see a rep drop off. And throughout the course of our training, we build fitness, but we also incur fatigue. So within the building fitness aspect of building strength and building work capacity, now we're able with that same load to get up to 10, 9, 9 or 10, 10, 10. But what I was really alluding to was for someone advanced like you or I, we might be progressing with reps, but generally we're not progressing load week to week. So it's not like week one, we're at 100 pounds for 3 sets of 10. The next week, we're at 105 pounds for 3 sets of
I agree.
10. It's
I
really
agree.
hard to get those. It's few and far between. So really, I kind of reserve the single progression model where it's very load based for more of my beginner trainees. And then I utilize the double progression method for my advanced trainees where we're starting to increase reps throughout the course of a mesocycle. And once they get to the point where they've built up they've essentially progressed to the point where they built up the work capacity and they've incurred enough positive adaptations due to the training that we've been doing, then we can look towards adding load instead of trying to artificially increase the load and really like skew the reps in reserved or perceived effort and really go to failure every single set just to try to eke out just to that target rep range, where a lot of times you're seeing that people are having, I guess, discrepancies in their technique, their exercise execution, and things of that sort. So, really, when I look at like progression models, the double progression method allows us to make progressive increases to the training stimulus that are still within our reach, and they're realistic for the rate of progress that we'd see when we're advanced. And it's a progression method that applies well to both multi joint compound movements and single joint isolation movements. As we first focus on rep progression until we've built the capacity to handle higher loads, and those apply to both things. So it's something like the one drawback that I see with single progression is a lot of times on isolation movements, because think about it like this: if we are doing dumbbell lateral raise, whether it is on an incline bench, whether it is a single arm dumbbell lateral raise, or just your typical standing dumbbell lateral raise, think about the progression that needs to be made, especially for like females, where a lot of gyms, they're only going to go by increments of 5 pounds. So it's not like they can just literally go up and they're going to be able to go from 15 to 20 pounds and really see not see a massive drop off in repetition. So that's where, say, a client's working between the 8 to 12 rep range on dumbbell laterals. I would rather have them, continue going up through, instead of, once they hit 3 sets or 4 sets of 8, then jump up to the next load progression, which would be from 15 pounds to 20 pounds, because that's a 25% increase. Or honestly, that's a 33% increase, because that's 5 pounds out of 15. That's 33% more weight. Whereas we could inch our way up through progressions of just adding 1 rep per week, just 1 rep to the set count per week, essentially, and really get a more, I guess, an easier progression method, not easier by any means, but it's easier to quantify in terms of their progression. And also, they're able to stay within a hypertrophy rep range. Because if I take someone, they're only doing sets of 8 with 15 pounds, I bring them to a 20, they might get like 4 or 5 reps, which really, it's not within. And when we really talk about low reps and high load versus high reps and low load, we see that there's pretty similar hypertrophy outcomes, but that's really from rep ranges between 6 and 30. But before that, within your 4 or 5 reps and below, we're not getting sufficient tension stimulus on the muscle to actually induce hypertrophy. So those are sets that are not going to be equally stimulative.
I think the biggest gift that any coach can do is help their clients through and through understand failure, like what that really is. And, you can do this safely with clients at 20 and 30 reps and then slowly work them down. Like if you just got because you're going to get some people who are just gun shy, like they're afraid they're going to hurt their back or hurt their knees. So I think in progressional models, 100% is beautiful what you're saying and all that. But I also think the caveat is like, if you're working with someone, them understanding the true intensity to put these progression models to use is a very key thing that most people miss. Because I'll watch people go in there and be like, oh, I did 10 reps. I'm like, yeah, but you barely even broke a sweat. Oh, next week I'll do 11. And I'm like, and that was part of my issue I had with Renaissance periodization when I did the training. Like every week I'd recover it. And before you know it, I got to like 8 sets of each exercise. And I was like, holy shit, I'm in here forever.
Utilizing not a double progression model. You were using an additive set model, correct? Because that is how RP designs. Yeah, so guys, just in case anyone isn't familiar, Jeff, if you want to explain or you want me to explain how their progression model goes, it's more additive through the set additions in a weekly basis and essentially in a proactive way where it's automatically increasing sets throughout the course of a mesocycle.
Correct, 100%. And I'll be honest with you, it was it got to be very, very time consuming. I did not like it. I didn't find I grew any better at doing that than 8 sets of T-bar row versus 4 sets of T-bar row and 4 sets of a high pull. I felt like I had a better workout. So
no, it's interesting that you say that because I had went to their initial seminar. So RP Strength, I have an immense amount of respect for them. I'm friends with Nick Shaw, who's actually one of the founders.
Oh, 100%. It's Mike. Beautiful.
Yeah, Dr. Mike Israel. No, they're immensely intelligent. However, I went to their first seminar because Mike used to be a college professor at Temple, which is down the street for where my aunt she's a dean of a medical school that's literally across the street from Temple. So I've been to his university, I've met him in person. And I went to their first ever seminar. I think this was 2017 or 2018. It was a training seminar. And this is really when they first started speaking about MRV, essentially maximum recoverable volume, maximal adaptable volume, and minimum recoverable volume. And those are their volume landmarks. And they started with this progression scheme model. And I tried it myself, where every week you essentially add 1 set to every exercise that you're utilizing for a body part. And really you see these drastic swings in volume, weekly volume for each muscle group. So you might start at 10 weekly working sets per week and end up at 24 by the end of the mesocycle. So it's pretty drastic increases in volume. And what I really saw was it was too proactive of a method for me because we cannot anticipate our recovery capacity or our adaptive capacity. Just like we can't do it for ourselves, we also can't do it for clients. So who's to say that automatically we're going to be able to adapt and recover to ever increasing volume if we haven't seen the effects that the previous week's volume has had on our recovery capacity, on our adaptability, and all these other thresholds, and also on performance. And it was kind of like it was automatically built in. It was only focused on volume progression, at least in the manner that I was, I used one of their templates, and that's how I ran, the training cycle. However, I'm really more of a fan, and Jeff, you can fill me in on how you go about this, but I'm more of a fan of reactive volume addition. So it's based off a client's recovery capacity, their pumps, their disruption, all these other markers and indices of both their stress within the training session itself. So how much of the stimulus are we getting through training, and also their recovery capacity as well as their progression within performance. And if there are indicators that they could handle more volume and actually benefit from it, then I will reactively increase volume for particular body parts that we're focusing on within that week. However, it's not a weekly thing where it's automatically added before I'm able to see clients' biofeedback. And generally, I have no clients that are at the point that I can add sets week in and week out every single week of a mesocycle.
So this is what I took away from RP. I thought it was a brilliant product for a lot of people, maybe in that intermediate realm, who were trying to really kind of understand what they could do, what they couldn't do, how deloads were programmed, all that. I found that I did not enjoy splitting my body part up into 2 times a week and that I am a guy who I literally like to do old school training. A lot of sets, one time a week, get it over with, and I just train better that way. I haven't noticed any difference in my recovery. I haven't noticed any difference in my body preps or anything like that. So I think it's a matter of finding what you like. But personally wouldn't prescribe, like Brandon is saying, to just a arbitrary every week you go up until you feel like you need to rant. I don't think there's truth to that. I think that it's very individual. I think everyone's CNS is very different. But that, I guess, should take us right into the should we aim to progress training VIA increases in load or reps? And I think it depends. And I think that you could kind of get there in both ways. I've always thought that reps to me was a superior way. Meaning, when I started getting towards 15 reps on everything, I knew I would make it a little bit heavier and get down to like 10 again and work my way up. I think that chasing a logbook leads to injuries. I haven't seen a person yet who's always chasing a logbook who hasn't come back from a pec tear, a bicep tear, or something awful. And I think John Meadows was right to some degree. There's many different ways to skin a cat, and you could do reps to get that. You could do all sorts of different things. And I think it's just a matter of finding what you like and what you could consistently do for a while. But I'm curious what you think about all that, because, should you chase load increases or rep increases? Does it even matter?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of put these two questions together because I'd received them from different listeners. However, this question essentially aligns closely with what we just covered in the first question
Yeah.
regarding, progression schemes. And like I mentioned previously, both the act of increasing load and reps are an effective method of increasing the training stimulus and progressing our training. However, when it comes to what method is better, we actually have a recent study that came out of Brad Schoenfeld's lab by Plotkin et al. That actually looks at comparing the two methods of training progression. So we're able to see, like, in the literature, in the research, what is better at doing, or is there something better, or is there a better method between load and between reps? And so in this study, they compared the different models of progressive overload essentially by having one group progress their training stimulus by increasing the amount of reps per set they did using the same load on the same exercises week in and week out. So across the entire study, they utilized the same exercises, the same load, and all their progressions were just made in terms of increasing the actual amount of reps they did per set, while the other group focused on remaining in the same rep range that they started with, but they progressed their training via load. So every week, when they were capable of it, they would increase load week to week. So this was a really interesting study because everything was equated besides their progression model, besides whether they were increasing reps or increasing load. And so both groups trained using the same amount of sets per week. They utilized the same exercises, the same proximity to failure. So the training programs were exactly equivalent in terms of volume and intensity. And what they found was that progressive overload via increasing reps was just as effective for hypertrophy as progressive overload via increasing load in trained individuals, as both approaches achieve similar increases in muscle growth, except for the rec fem of the quadricep, where muscle growth modestly favored the group that increased reps on a weekly basis. And these findings make sense if you really think about it, because we've seen in research that we can get equivalent increases in muscle hypertrophy training in a variety of rep ranges. So that can be anywhere, like in the literature, we see anywhere from 6 reps to 30 reps per set will will give equivalent hypertrophy outcomes as long as each set is taken relatively close to failure and the number of sets you do within those rep ranges are equated between conditions. So you could do essentially, and it's not that I'm recommending this, but say that you're doing 10 weekly sets per week for a muscle group. You could do 10 sets of 6 or 10 sets of 30. And as long as they're both within the same proximity of failure, you'll get very equivalent outcomes on an average basis. That doesn't mean that there aren't individuals that they're genetically more predisposed towards responding better to high loads and low rep ranges, or low loads and high rep ranges, or they just have a psychological proclivity towards one or the other. But seeing as we can get the same increases in muscle growth from, say, 3 sets of 8 to 10 reps and 3 sets of 20 to 25 reps, if they're both taken close to failure, this means we can progress our training stimulus by either increasing load and staying within a lower rep range target, or we could maintain our load and increase the amount of reps, like Jeff was alluding to, that we do to ensure we're still hitting a close proximity to failure. Now, the one difference besides like the difference in muscle growth in the rep fen that they did find in the study was that muscular strength outcomes slightly favored the increased load group, but both groups increased strength. So there wasn't major differences between the two. But think about it just from like a logistical standpoint, just logically. Like if you're increasing load week to week, you're really doing something that's training specificity. So you're increasing the amount of load that your muscles can, obviously lift, and the adaptations within that will be strength dependent or be more strength biased. So it makes sense. Like if you're trying to get stronger, you should be increasing load. But if that isn't, strength and hypertrophy aren't these linear constructs. Essentially, they do go hand in hand in many capacities. But it's not like you have to get stronger, like in a sense of like a powerlifting scenario, to build muscle. So really, when it comes down to it, is Jeff and I have been alluding to, really you can progress your training in either method and get very equivalent or very significant outcomes in terms of your muscle development. But it really comes back down to, what are you going to do effort fully? Like, what are you going to put intention into? What are you going to like be able to take to the house? Is it something, are you someone that gets up for high load sets for heavy lifting? Or are you someone that would rather really bury yourself with a higher rep set and really get that lactate accumulation and that hydrogen ion, really feel the burn? It's really what is more biased towards you. And we also have to think about joint structure. We have to think about anthropometrics, the way your body is set up, and all
What
those
is
other things.
what is that?
Essentially, like your limb lengths and things like that. So,
Okay,
for
because
instance,
no
if you
one
have
know
long,
that. Yeah.
yeah. So if you have long limbs, if you have long, like for me, I'm not a barbell back squatter. I did it all throughout college. I've had a knee reconstruction surgery at this point, but I'm 6'2". I got long femurs, a shorter torso for my body. If I was to really try to specialize in like a low bar back squat, it's just not something that's conducive for the way my body is structured. So that might, like, high or heavy weight, low bar back squats isn't something that's going to be biomechanically advantageous to me. However, if you have short femurs, you have really good ankle mobility, you have a long torso, and you're really like, you're built like a Chinese weightlifter, low bar back squats are like going to be your bread and butter. So it really, we have to really cater towards different aspects of our individual characteristics. And that's really what I was trying to get to.
Yeah, no, I wanted to. That was good you elaborated on that because, I watch people squat in the gym. And dude, I swear on my life, I've seen maybe in the 28 years I've been in a gym, 10 people that ever had just beautiful form squatting, because they're limb lengths and things like that. And I
Yeah,
watch these other people just fucking do the exercise. I'm like, that is a horrible exercise for you. Stop doing it.
Yeah, honestly. And here's the thing. So really with squatting, a lot of times what ends up happening, especially when you go through a full range of motion squat with a free weight motion or a free weight movement like a barbell back squat, is a lot of people, they offload a lot of the tension, stimulus, or the weight actually onto their low back, their erectors, and their glutes. And these are accessory muscle groups that do come into play. But really, if you're trying to drive, your goal is hypertrophy, and we're trying to get a sufficient stimulus on the quadriceps, we really need forward knee flexion. So we really want to force our knees past our toes, and a lot of people can't do that due to lack of ankle mobility. They would need an elevated heel. They would need things to be able to put them in a more advantageous position. That's really where I like to look towards exercise selection, and I would rather utilize a more stable exercise like a hack squat, like a pendulum squat, that puts them in a position where they can just lock themselves in. They don't have to worry about stabilization, and they can just really focus on nailing the execution that is needed to drive a tension stimulus on that target musculature.
I actually bought a pendulum squat for Iron House and a new hack squat so I could do that stuff safely since my chiropractor has been doing amazing work on me. And he's like, hey, you got to load your spine a little bit. That would probably be safer. So I said, fuck it, done deal. So
Good for
we're in
you, my
person.
man.
So yeah, no, I remember using it at Destination Dallas when I was down there for the Cowboys game a couple of years ago on Thanksgiving and just being like, damn, man, my legs felt good. It didn't bug my hips, not my back. And I was still at my hip.
You're speaking about the pendulum squat,
Yeah.
right?
No,
Yeah.
I think a spirit piece equipment. I think Jim should do it. I'm actually looking at getting some Atlantis equipment, but that's a whole nother episode. So that's actually a beautiful segue. How to approach exercise order when programming. I think this is all about one person's goals and where they're trying to go and years and so forth. Like a Mrs. Jones, she doesn't know if what body parts are good or bad. So you kind of just throw together a melee workout and just kind of see. But if you're talking, Brandon, where do you want to go with this? Or you want to go more gym pop, or you want to cover it from a broad spectrum? Overall, we want to get in the research on it because it's so deep of a topic, dude.
Yeah, I'll take it all over the place, my man. So I'll allude to how this came about. So
Okay,
essentially,
sure.
this topic essentially comes from a question I received regarding exercise order, and then also what considerations we would make when determining the order of exercise in a training session. So really, when it comes down to exercise order, that's essentially just another way to refer to exercise sequencing. So we can essentially sequence exercise order in many different ways, but generally, what I'm looking to do is use the principle of prioritization. So I'm placing exercises that train the muscle I most want to develop and target in a session first. So that's always the lens that I look through programming first and foremost. So for example, if I'm working on a push-pull leg split and I'm designing a push day, which is going to include my chest, deltoids, and then triceps training, the order of how I program that session is going to be based off the needs and wants of the particular client that I'm working with. So in my case, I'll tell you personally, I'm always going to put chest work first because that is a lagging body part for me. However, in most cases, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sequence chest exercises first in the session. However, I do have some clients who have great chest development and they have lagging delts. So in that case, I'd consider placing exercises that target their delts first in the session, and that would be
Right.
based off prioritization. So I'm trying to give more energy into and more focus on the exercises that are going to stimulate the muscles we need more work on or more development towards. However, if I'm programming for a client like one of my pros, like Anthony Scalza, he has extremely dominant delts. That has always been a great body part of his, but we've done many chest specialization cycles. And so with him, I'm going to program his chest exercises first to place more of an emphasis on bringing his chest up before I do any deltoid work. Another consideration within exercise order is whether we should program compound exercises prior to isolation movements. And more times than not, I'm going to place a multi-joint compound exercise first in a session. And then I'm going to follow it by single joint exercises because I'm generally trying to drive performance most on the compound exercises. So by doing them first in a session, we do them when we have the least amount of fatigue as compared to doing them later in the session when we have accumulated fatigue, which can impact our training output. However, when we actually look at the research on exercise order and hypertrophy outcomes, we see that when it comes to muscle growth, we can attain similar outcomes in muscle by doing compounds followed by isolations, or we can get the same type of muscle growth vice versa, meaning doing isolations first followed by compounds. So for example, in 2021, there was a meta-analysis by Nunez, and he looked at the effects of exercise order and how that exercise order affected muscle hypertrophy and muscle strength outcomes. And when it came to muscle hypertrophy, they found that both multi-joint exercises followed by single joint exercises and single joint exercises followed by multi-joint exercises produced similar outcomes in muscle growth. So it really didn't matter the order of these things. They came out to equivalent outcomes. However, when they came to strength, they found that increases in strength were the largest in exercises performed early in the session. So that's really what I was alluding to with the principle of priority or prioritization. Because if your priority is improving specific exercises, you're going to benefit from doing them first, and that makes logistical sense. But there are people that they program in a little bit different a manner. But really, when it comes down to it, overall, when it comes down to exercise order and programming, I really believe in prioritizing the muscle group and exercises we most want to bring up early in the session when you have adequate energy resources, when you're locked in mentally, you're not suffering from both physical fatigue and potentially mental fatigue from having been in the gym for an extended period of time. Because we all know that towards the end of our session, it's when we're feeling more depleted in terms of energy resources. We're feeling more tired, more fatigued. And generally, it's those last few exercises that kind of get I don't want to say less effort, but we're putting in the same amount of effort, but we're getting less output. So it's like we're getting less bang for our buck.
Yep, you're
And
right.
often I'll notice people that towards the end of their session, things get ugly, to be honest with you. And that's where I really look at multi-joint and single joint isolations. Like if I'm going to have someone do a multi-joint compound movement at the end of the session, a lot of times if they're not someone that's very locked in terms of their actual training capacity, their movement efficiency, their technical proficiency on a specific movement, I'm generally not going to have someone do a barbell back squat, their last exercise at the end of a long ass leg day, because I know that a lot of times their form's going to break down. And unless they have the ability to put their ego aside and use a much lighter weight and essentially utilize all the single joint isolations we use first as a pre-exhaust method to be able to fatigue, the specific muscle groups we're looking at, the quadriceps in particular, before going to the squat and then just focusing on really good form, I'm generally not going to program that last in a session.
I agree with you 100%. I, at my age, have decided I do a lot of isolation stuff before I get into my compounds, or I do a lot of superset, i.e. isolation into compound. Scott Stevenson taught fortitude training at my gym, and that was something that kind of stuck with me, was kind of doing, loading it and then hitting it, and I've enjoyed that. I have a question for you, though. What do you think about people putting exercises that they have to modify machines with early in their workouts? Like, meaning You know how you'll see someone set a handle up on a fucking hammer strength machine, and that's like their first exercise. Do you think that that's a smart way to start your workout? Because I personally would not start my workout that way. I would start it for my back, more of a straight arm pull down, more of a facing away from the stack pull down, a one arm cable row. I would look at other mechanisms rather than doing spiffy setups. You can
Yeah,
see
can
it
you
being all the
elaborate?
rage.
Maybe, yeah,
Well,
can
you
you
know how
elaborate
people
on maybe
modify.
what you're looking for?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is when you do an exercise selection, do you think that modified exercises should be in the first part of the exercises? Because those are becoming a big thing now. You'll see people sitting sideways on a leg press for like their first exercise. People doing all different stuff. Do you think that that's the smartest way to start their workouts? Is what I'm getting at. When you program, do you program off smart or do you program off of what, I don't know, maybe is just different that you want to try? That's worth
Yeah, so
asking.
if we're talking about like very unique exercise variations,
Sure. Yeah.
generally that's not going to go first in a session. It's going to be more of a
Thank you.
basic movement. However, there are certain times that I have specific clients that they're a little bit more, first of all, they're more advanced. Second of all, we have gotten to a point in their really how I look at this is it's almost ass backwards how a lot of people go about programming. A lot of the younger and the less advanced individuals like to utilize all these sexy biomechanical advantageous exercises when they haven't built the bare bone basics. They haven't built a foundation of movement efficiency or proficiency, and so they haven't ever gotten a lot of their compound movements down pat. And then they're looking for all these hacks to to gain 5% more lat activation and this, that, and the other, when they really haven't been able to actually connect with that muscle to begin with. So I don't believe in utilizing that. However, I do have certain clients that I've utilized specialization cycles with. And that is where if someone is truly advanced and they're close to their genetic ceiling, that's where I see we're utilizing a little bit, I guess, more advanced biomechanic or more advanced biomechanics in terms of movement or exercise setup, maybe different handle, different execution and things like that are a little bit more beneficial. But generally, for most people, they're not going to need those things. So I wouldn't put them first in a session, especially if it's more of an isolation movement. That is, if you're putting a lot of intention into that, I would prefer to utilize that later on in a session. Once you've gotten like more of your bang for your buck exercises, put a lot of workout, put first and foremost, and really gotten a ton of tension stimulus on the target musculature. If you want to utilize a sexy, variation or something, sometimes I'll have clients send me videos of things that they've seen on Instagram. And as long as it's not a swipe workout, but it's an exercise that targets, say a small muscle group like the delts or like, the biceps that they want to utilize, they feel comfortable with, and it's exciting for them. That's another thing that we can't take enjoyment out of training. So there's progression, but towards the end, like if we're looking at small muscle groups, like your arms or your deltoids, and there's a different movement. They don't want to do, a dumbbell lateral and they don't want to do cable laterals, but they want to use this specific exercise variation that they've seen on Instagram. I'm going to look at the movement profile. I'm going to look at the resistance profile. And if it's something that's so conducive to what we're trying to do from a stimulus perspective, I'm going to let them, play around with that and see if they can execute it correctly. And if they send me videos and they have the execution down, um it's indicating that they're actually getting a tension stimulus on the target musculature. So it's a side delt movement and they're getting, tension in that side delt, then I'm gonna let them use it. But it's gonna be later on in the session.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that because I've seen that be like the new trend. I'll watch these guys and girls come in like do these like weird adjustments, and I'm like, that's a bad way to start. But that was just my thoughts, and I like to always pass it to others.
Man, I gotta be honest with you, Jeff. I see nothing in the gym because I'm in the gym at like 5 a.m. and
Yeah.
it's just old school guys. It's a lot of old cops that I grew up training around, and these are serious individuals. So there's not a lot of talking, and there's a lot of work being done. And so that's how I
Um,
prefer it. But I don't see a lot of these. I'm not seeing kids. I'm not. No kids, no college or young guys are in the gym at 5 a.m. So I kind of miss that. So that's why I wanted you to elaborate on the question a little bit more. I see some of this stuff on Instagram, but a lot of stuff. I think that a lot of things that we see within the training context of Instagram is more infotainment than it is, than actual information and actual how people are programming. Because I'll tell you, I've worked with people with hundreds of thousands of followers and I've coached them and I know what their programming looks like, but I know that their swipe workouts look incredibly different than the programming that I'm having them do week in and week out. And I know that it's not just that they're doing those, they're not doing my workouts because they're sending me video footage of them doing the workouts and their top sets. And then when I ask them about these secondary workouts I see on Instagram, they're just recording it for content. And I understand that. really, when it comes down to it, progression within training comes from doing the basics and doing the same boring program week in, week out, and progressing within, things that you're good at. And a lot of times it isn't about sexy movements and it isn't about switching things up and quote unquote confusing the muscle, but those are what sell on Instagram for a swipe workout. So, they give what the people are looking for.
Thanks for clearing that all up and getting that short up. I want to ask you this one though, because we got our last two ahead. Explaining the mind muscle connection, when to focus on the mind muscle connection. I think you should focus on that the whole time, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we might disagree on this one, my man, because this was something that was always very interesting to me, and it wasn't until the last couple of years that we've actually had literature that looked into this. So the mind muscle connection is essentially the subjective feeling that you get from a muscular contraction during training, and this involves focusing on squeezing, contracting, and isolating a muscle when training it. And a lot of you guys will be familiar with this. This is something that Arnold's been talking about since pumping iron. You know what I mean? The mind muscle connection, really putting the mind on the muscle and really being intentional with your training, which I do think has a lot of benefits and a lot of downstream effects on our training. But there's a time to use it, maybe a time to steer away from it or to not emphasize it as much. So using the mind muscle connection during an exercise means you intentionally aim to contract a specific muscle when doing a particular exercise. So, an example of this for anyone that isn't familiar with the concept or you're hearing it for the first time is essentially like a good way to look at this would be aiming to feel your bicep fully during a bicep cable curl. So, you're really putting the mind on the muscle. You're looking to contract the bicep to a peak contraction, put it through extension and flexion, and really getting a good connection with the actual bicep muscle during the exercise itself. But when we look at it, the mind muscle connection is an example of what's called internal attentional focus. And that's one form of attentional focus that we can use when we're training. But there's two forms of intentional focus. So we have internal attentional focus, which is when we focus on using a specific muscle during an exercise, such as focusing on contracting the pecs during a dumbbell press. And so this is more of a muscle focus exercise. Now, on the other hand, we also can use what's called an external attentional focus when we're training, which is when we focus on moving a weight from point A to point B. And so in this type of approach, we're not focused as much on the muscle itself, but more so we're focused on moving the weight up, and essentially getting the lift up. And so on a bench, this would be getting, essentially getting the barbell off our chest. And so this is more of a movement focus exercise, which we'd usually use during, say, a 1 rep max testing or performance testing. And when it comes to performance, such as maximizing force production and strength, using an external focus generally yields better outcomes as compared to using an internal focus. However, when it comes to hypertrophy, there is some data, and this is stuff that has just come out in the last couple of years. So really, we haven't seen much literature on this until about 5 years ago. But there is some data that suggests that using an internal focus, aka the mind-muscle connection, can potentially increase muscle activation as well as muscle growth. So in a study by Paoli in 2019, I believe, they looked at different muscle activity on the bench press when subjects were given different verbal cues. And what they did was they split up subjects into 3 groups. And one group wasn't giving any verbal cue at all. One group was given a verbal cue, and what they were told was to focus on using their chest during a bench press. And then the last group, group number 3, was told to focus on their triceps during the bench. And they found that verbal cueing increased muscle activity of the muscles being cued when using lighter loads of 50% of 1 rep max. So the group that was told to focus on their chest had the highest chest activation in this study. And the group instructed to focus on the triceps had the greatest tricep activation. However, at heavier loads, the verbal cues did not increase muscle activity of a specific muscle, even when they were given those cues. And instead, what we saw was increased muscle activity of both the chest, the delts, and the triceps. And really, where this comes back to is you have to realize when you're getting closer to maximal output and you're moving heavier loads, especially in like a compound multi-joint movement, our body's going to recruit as much muscle as possible to lift the load. It's going to make things as efficient as possible to get the load off of us. Now, that is on muscle activation itself. So that was a recent study from 4 years ago on just muscle activation. Now, when it comes to how the mind-muscle connection affects hypertrophy outcomes, the one study we do have on this topic was done by Brad Schoenfeld back in 2018. And what he did was he looked at the hypertrophy effects of using an internal versus an external focus on both the quadriceps and biceps during an 8-week training study. So what they did was they split up groups into an internal training group and an external focus group. And so the internal focus group focus on contracting the bicep during curls and the quads during leg extensions, whereas the external focus group focus on just moving the weight up. And the results found significantly greater increases in bicep growth in the group using the mind muscle connection. So this group saw almost double the biceps growth than the group using the external focus. So we see that there's a substantial increase, especially in the biceps, in terms of utilizing that mind to muscle connection as compared to just lifting the weight up. So when it comes to the question of when to use an internal versus an external focus, I'd suggest to use a mind muscle connection, or AKA the internal focus technique when you're looking to target a specific muscle group. So it's best to use this approach when utilizing or when doing, isolation single joint exercises. And another, utility or another case in which we could use the mind muscle connection to improve upon our training is if you have trouble feeling a muscle, this is a time where it may benefit you from intentionally focusing on that muscle during an exercise. Now, on the other hand, it's best to use an external focus and focus on moving a weight from point A to point B if your goal is strength progression. So if we have someone out in the audience and they're really trying to get stronger and they're trying to increase their 1 rep max, that's where utilizing an external focus is going to be more advantageous for you. And this is why an external focus has been shown in some studies to be better for heavy multi-joint compound movements in lower rep ranges. So within our training, we have to realize that there's a time and place for everything, whether it be an exercise technique, a machine versus a free weight, a different progression model, increasing load via increasing reps, or even utilizing an internal versus an external focus. And so there are certain times when utilizing a mind to muscle connection is beneficial. And then there's other times when we're really trying to drive strength progression, maybe in a strength block, where using an external focus can be beneficial. So it's not just one or the other. Really within training, it's never one or the other. It's often, let's look at utilizing a blend of the two when it is able to most benefit our goals as well as maximize our outcomes.
Last one. This one I might chime in on because I've been doing it a lot. Breaking down blood flow restriction training. What is it, how it works, and how to do it?
All right. So after one of our last episodes, I'm not sure if it was last week or the week before, however, I discussed, we were discussing training and I had come out about how I'm using blood flow restriction within my current arm training. So I received a few questions regarding BFR. So I figured we'd cover it on the show. And so for those who aren't familiar with blood flow restriction, I'll explain what it is. We'll go into some of the mechanisms behind it and then how to utilize it if you guys want to try it for yourself. And so when it comes to blood flow restriction, this is essentially a type of training that partially restricts blood flow by using a cuff applied proximal to a limb, which in terms of blood flow restriction, the only time that we would apply a cuff is either to our upper arm or our upper thigh. So we're not including anything but our limbs. And so what we're doing is we're limiting blood flow from getting out of either our arms or our legs, which increases the buildup of metabolic byproducts. So this allows blood flow to get into a limb, but it doesn't allow blood flow to get out. So there's a quicker accumulation of this metabolic byproduct. So when I say partially restriction, and sometimes people, they mess this up and they really try to include the limb like where there's no blood flow, we still want, blood to get into the muscle. We still want nutrients getting delivered. We just want to restrict it from being, out. And so what BFR does is allows us to get substantial muscle hypertrophy, even with loads as low as 20% of 1 repetition max. And it's been shown to be as effective as traditional resistance training for muscle growth. But essentially what it does is it lowers the load threshold we need to hit to induce muscle growth. As research finds that we need to train with at least 30% of our 1 repetition max to get significant hypertrophy with traditional training. Whereas like I just alluded to with blood flow restriction, we can get that from 20% of 1 rep max. And so BFR doesn't provide more muscle growth than traditional training, but it does allow us to get the same muscle growth with lower loads and is usually done with anywhere from 20 to 50% of our 1 rep max. So it's a great method to implement into our training when say we're injured or we're dealing with nagging joint or tendon issues and we can't use the same heavy loads or the same heavy movements that we're used to doing within our training. Another time that it's great to utilize is if you don't have access to heavy training. Maybe you're on a vacation or you're training at home and you don't have the same, type of access to plates, dumbbells, and things of that sort that you had when you had full access to a gym. And really, the reason for this is it makes lighter loads or lighter training more challenging. So it makes it more effortful so that we get closer to a closer proximity to failure. We feel fatigue and we're able to essentially get more stimulation as a result of that. But another case, and this is actually something I want to bounce off to you, Jeff, is another case that I found this to be really useful. And I utilized this years in the past. This is actually when I first started utilizing blood flow restriction. So the last time I used it before this current block was after my surgery. However, when I first started using blood flow restriction was actually in a contest prep. And the reason for that was I'd gotten to such a low body fat that I was starting to get nagging joint issues like I am now, but it was really exacerbated by a lack of condition or lack of cushioning, essentially, a lack of, fat in my my diet and a lot of lack of body fat in general. So I found it to be a really good, a beneficial way to still get a stimulation on, certain muscle groups, my legs. I particularly used it on my arms at that time as well. And it allowed me to do so without getting a lot of the nagging joint issues that I was dealing with at that time, especially when I was like getting to a point where I was very dry in terms of conditioning. A few weeks out from a contest, I started, transitioning to using BFR training in addition to my regular training, or subbing out essentially some of my arm training volume with BFR training. And I know right now you're utilizing it in your own prep. So, if you have anything you could add to in terms of the benefits that you've seen within your own training, not only from like an injury perspective, but also from the fact that you're getting substantially leaner. Like you've come down quite substantially, and you recently tagged me in one of your updates, and you're already peeled, my man. So like in comparison, when you look back, because I can tell you from my own experience, when I look back from preps where I was getting extremely lean and I didn't use BFR compared to the preps that I really was digging myself into the hole in terms of conditioning, really getting myself dug out, but I used BFR, I found some benefits from it.
I'll be honest with you. I notice when I do my leg training on Saturday in my BFR. So this is my workout. I do a 10-minute warm up, and then I do my one leg hip thrusters. I do clamshells. I do step ups for 2 sets. And then I do 2 to 3 warm ups, probably 30 to 40 reps on leg extension to get blood in. I think before you do BFR, it's important to get blood in.
So you're saying you're doing that without the actual
correct
cuff, correct?
So I get the blood kind of going, I get myself moving, then I cuff it and I go for tight. I go about an 8 out of 10. I tell people you want to be able to get like at least a finger underneath there, but not like a hole, be able to slide that baby in. Like there wants to be a little tension there. And then be honest, I do the usual. They say it's like 30 reps and then you go 15, 15, 15. I will start at 30 reps and then I will go as many reps as I can. So this Saturday it was 30, then it was like 24, and then it was 18, and then it was like 16, and it dropped like that. But I did 7 sets of leg extension. I kept them on, and then I went over to adductors, did 1 pump set of 30 at a lightweight, and then began 7 sets of BFR, and then I took them off, and then did my leg curl. I think that they're amazing as far as injury prevention. My legs actually, I think, have gotten better using them. There's just something to be said about when you're pumped. I think you just have a better feeling, better workout. And I think it's more metabolically challenging. Like, I mean, after I do it, dude, I'm starving the whole day. Like, I mean, I feel very fatigued. And I'll put this in perspective. Like I tell people, if you do the leg extension, adductors, and then do your leg curl and then go leg press, I guarantee you that you can do half the weight on the leg press.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, I mean,
it does have it.
We're
going to go into the mechanisms, but it does increase fatigue quite substantially in terms of peripheral fatigue,
Yep.
which really refers to fatigue on the muscle fiber itself, not systemic fatigue, because we don't see the same. So there's different mechanisms of fatigue. We have systemic fatigue, which is total accumulated fatigue. And that could be from training, from life, from relationships, from work, from all these different things that accumulate. And that can be really induced by muscle damage. So the soreness, the late onset muscle soreness, and essentially the trauma that you induce during training. However, one of the benefits of BFR, just so go off on a little bit of a tangent, but one of the benefits of BFR is it induces less muscle damage. So we see a better recovery capacity from it. However, it increases fatigue, but in the muscle itself. So it's not getting much of that systemic fatigue, but it is increasing that peripheral fatigue, which is on the muscle itself.
Yeah, no, and I'll be honest, dude. I feel like it's a little bit safer for me. And I feel like I just get more out of it. I mean, before I would do the leg press, my legally disabled crippled self put 6-7 plates on there like an idiot on each side, and I would just grind it because that's just what I was taught to do. But now I do like that BFR, man. Like, I mean, the rest of the day I'm just taxed, but the next day I get up, I'm kind of recovered already. And then I remember at the PEC, we were chatting with Scott Stevenson, and he talked about a guy did BFR every single day for like 6 weeks straight and came back to the gym and his legs all blown up and stuff like that. And remember, Scott was talking about that, and I was like, wow, that's impressive. So I started using it. And I think if you've got injuries, I think if you're bored with your training, I think that it could suit a lot of different things. But I would make sure that I was well hydrated by doing that. So just because of the
Yeah.
clotting risk and things like that, there's never been issues involving that. I think they over speculate that a whole bunch.
Yeah,
And I
we
think you'd
don't
have to
so
like tourniquet that shit off to get that problem
so
anyway.
that's the big thing. That is why we no longer, or in the literature, they no longer refer to it as occlusion training, because there have been, when we think about occluding a limb, that is completely restricting blood flow. So now the reason, and there's different terms within the literature, but really the research that has come out, and that's, the research that I've exposed myself to is on blood flow restriction as compared to previous. This type of training came from Japan, and it came from Katsu training, which is more of an occlusion based training. And so that's where we actually saw the inventor of Katsu training actually had something related to a blood clot, something within that realm. And
They were
so within
walking though in that study that had that issue, weren't they? They were like walking for like 45 or
they do have
60 minutes or something,
they
right?
do have walking studies, but you have to think about,
Yeah.
like, logically. First of all, like I mentioned, we're partially restricting blood flow into a limb, so it's not a full occlusion. Then it's done for only a few minutes at a time, and it's not like hours at a time where you would really risk the chance of a blood clot or even high blood pressure and things of that sort. And we have not seen it in healthy populations, any issues of that sort. So there aren't really, I've spoken to DPTs about this, so physical therapists, about blood flow restriction, and they're well versed. Actually, I was very fortunate that when I went through my surgery, there was a doctor of physical therapy that has actually published with Brad Schoenfeld on the some of the mechanisms of blood flow restriction and how it could impact, or how it could benefit physique athletes. But he also works within the physical therapy realm, so he does it from a rehabilitative perspective. So that's where I consulted him on. However, really what we see in the literature is that it's a really beneficial modality for inducing muscle growth, or for helping with muscle retention during a time of disuse, or a time of when you're unable to train at your normal capacity. And really, when we look at how it works, blood flow restriction works in a few ways, and that's how it essentially, there's a few ways in which it stimulates muscle growth. So first, it provides a sufficient amount of mechanical tension on our muscle fibers. And when we look at mechanical tension, this is the most potent driver of muscle hypertrophy, as muscle tension is the tension stimulus that kicks off what we refer to as like a biochemical cascade. And that's what really increases muscle protein synthesis. And we've covered this many times in the past on the show. Muscle protein synthesis, that process of accreting new muscle proteins, is what leads to muscle growth. So it creates this chain reaction that causes muscle protein synthesis and goes down to muscle growth. But it also, like Jeff was alluding to kind of in his feedback on what he feels during the sessions itself, it causes, or it increases the accumulation of metabolic byproducts like lactate and hydrogen ions, and it causes these to build up quicker, which thus induces more muscle fatigue quicker in a set. So essentially what that does is it causes us to reach failure and get full motor recruitment, or motor unit recruitment, as well as muscle fiber recruitment. So now we've activated everything. Whereas a lot of times with lower loads, you really have to go towards these really high rep ranges, so 30 plus reps, to get full muscle fiber activation. So if you were to use, we actually see in research that if you were to use 20% of a one rep max like you would in BFR, you would not induce sufficient hypertrophy as compared to utilizing with blood flow. And essentially that's because you would have to do so many reps that it would be really hard to get to failure, because you'd have such a metabolite buildup. However, it would be 50, 60 reps or more. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
not something realistic that people are going to do set on set out. However, BFR brings down that threshold to 30 reps, and then you're going to see the rep drop off from there. So essentially what it does is BFR checks all the boxes needed for muscle growth. So, it checks the mechanical tension and stress on the target muscle box. It checks the full motor unit recruitment and muscle fiber recruitment box. But it's also able to do so with lighter weights, because using a cuff that includes blood flow to the muscles that are located distal to the cuff, it makes it so these muscles that lie under the cuff. So you put the cuff on the upper arm, the muscles under that, so your biceps and triceps, it essentially makes them work harder to contract. So it makes lightweight training more challenging and more effortful set to set. And so it's similar to traditional training, except it doesn't induce as much muscle damage as traditional training. So we're getting all the stimulation without as much muscle damage. So when it comes to how to use it, because this was the last question that I had gotten in regards to how to go about utilizing it in a practical format. And really, when it comes down to it, if you're interested in trying BFR, I'm going to walk you through like the process of how to utilize it in a training session, essentially. So first, you're going to want to purchase BFR cuffs and apply it to either the upper arm or the upper thigh. And most research that we have on the topic of what's called practical BFR, meaning it's not in a research setting where they're actually able to get the occlusion pressure cuff. They're not able to see your systolic blood pressure and different measurements of like the millimeters of mercury on your arm. Utilize different suggestions for practical BFR. So this is like how practical BFR essentially refers to how we would do it outside of a lab scenario. So the research on practical BFR suggests that we wrap at a 7 out of 10 pressure, as we want to partially restrict blood flow, but not completely occlude the limbs. So generally, when I do it myself and I wrap my limbs, I aim to have it tight enough to have a noticeable difference, but it shouldn't be painful prior to starting the first set. And this is a big thing. Like if you already notice, it's going to be it's going to be uncomfortable. However, if it's already painful before you've ever even started one rep, you've wrapped it too tight. And there's a variety of approaches we can use in how to use BFR, but one way to do so is the traditional 30, 15, 15, 15 method with 30 seconds rest in between each set, which is the approach where most of the research uses because it's able to standardize the study conditions. So essentially in this, you would use 20% or higher of your one repetition max and aim to hit 30 reps in your first set. And that's what we call a buy-in set. So essentially you're getting to a point where you're already starting to induce fatigue because you've done a 30 rep set. It's already almost a failure. And by the end of the set, you should start burning and you should start feeling some fatigue, which is why after that, we're going to aim for 3 sets of 15 reps. But just realize that the 15 reps is just a rep target. And in reality, I find that, I experience more of a rep drop off with each subsequent set. So generally, I'll kind of walk you through how it looks when I do this. So I'll generally do my first set, which is between 25 and 30 reps. I wait 30 seconds, and then I'll usually get that 15 reps in that second set. However, by the third set, I'm lucky to hit like 12 reps. And generally by the last set, I'm getting around 10 reps because I've induced fatigue. So ultimately, the reps are less important than actually reaching a substantial, level of fatigue, as this should be uncomfortable and challenging despite being light. So that's really what we're aiming for. We're not trying to just use light weights to make it easy. Light does not equal easy. This is still challenging.
Yeah,
This is
no, it
still something
hurts.
like this burns. It's very
It,
uncomfortable. And
I
that's why a
hate
lot of
it.
people
I
don't want to
hate it.
utilize it, but
I
it's
freaking
effective.
hate it. It is
And
effective, but I hate
and
it.
that's the thing. So we're always looking for it's really funny because within this industry, it's almost like we're always looking for sometimes like people will come to me for advice or for optimizing things. And a lot of times I find like people are trying to optimize their way out of hard work. And so with BFR, a lot of times you think about it and it sounds like a hack. It sounds like a biohack where like you can utilize light weights and get the same hypertrophy outcomes. Yes, you can, but you still got to work your ass off. You're still going to be uncomfortable. You're still going to be in a ton of pain. And you're going to be wishing to get those cuffs off and to be done with your sets. And I know
Damn
Jeff
right.
can relate to me on that. And so this isn't a way out of hard work. This doesn't make training easier. It allows lightweight training to be more effective than it would be on a set to set basis with the same equivalent amount of load. And so by the end of the sets, what you're going to notice is substantial swelling in the occluded limb. And really it's going to be a pump. You're going to, you're really accumulating a lot of those lactate ions, or lactate and these hydrogen ions and all these metabolic byproducts that are going to be swelling and causing that cell swelling effect, which, it's really cool. You get a great pump, and no one's going to complain about that. So these are like the mechanisms. This is how you utilize it. Essentially, it's a method that it isn't, and I want to make this clear, this isn't to replace traditional training. However, if you're someone that's dealing with injury, you don't have access, like you're at a home gym now. I just had a client recently. He moved from he just relocated and he just moved from the area in which he was originally living, and he just doesn't like the gym structure. He's uncomfortable, and he has enough equipment to work out at home. So I've been having him utilize BFR. Because he has barbells, he's got like a bench setup as well as a rack setup in terms of like barbell squats and things of that sort. But he doesn't have a lot of free weights, machines, and things of that sort to actually like specifically target his biceps and triceps. So we're utilizing, because he has lightweight, we're utilizing more BFR training within that. So it's able to make things a little bit more efficient and effective. However, it's still hard work. It's still something that it's a complement or a supplement to your training, but it isn't to replace normal, hard, heavy training. So just want to make that clear, but I wanted to elaborate on this topic because we had kind of breezed by it a couple weeks ago when I spoke on it, but we had some questions regarding it, and it's something that both Jeff and I have found benefits from in specific phases. So hear us out. This isn't something we utilize year round. Everything within training should be periodized. This isn't something that I would replace my leg training going forward for the rest of the time, or I would replace my arm training going forward for the rest of the time. However, Jeff's dealing with an injury currently. I'm dealing with some nagging elbow issues. And so we're utilizing in place,
Yep.
and especially in the condition that Jeff's in right now, especially, due to the fact that he's in contest prep, he's extremely lean. This is the perfect time to utilize it. So it is a tool in the toolbox that we can take out when the time is right.
Damn right. 100%. Hey, can I read something that just came over just a second ago?
Absolutely.
Dear Jeff, great work here. This is a strong draft. Your story took some surprising turns. I thought I knew where it was headed, assuming it was going to be a more straightforward overcoming against odds narrative, but it turned out to be something a good deal more interesting and ultimately more affecting. What will stay with me the most is the theme of how through all the physical and medical challenges in your youth, no one was looking out for your mental and emotional health. Gave me my plan, and then he's going to be back in touch with me. And then he said, it was really a pleasure to read my book and all that. So that was some cool feedback, man.
That's
my first time
incredible,
ever
man.
writing a book, and I didn't get like slaughtered at the lamb. So I was
Is
pretty
that
happy.
the editor, or is that who I think it is?
That's my editor.
Okay.
No,
I wasn't sure if it was Steve.
Steven's already blessed it. There's some changes he said I needed to make, but he wanted to see what the editor said. And that's just because, your eye's only going to see it so many times. I did 5 revisions. Absolutely. And it's nice when other people read and go, well, that could be tied a little bit. So once again, it Bridget. 100%. So should be out in the next 6 months tops is what they're telling me. So this is cool stuff. So
congrats, my man. That's incredible and awesome feedback to see the least.
Yeah, no doubt, dude. So where can guys, this was hopefully a great episode for you all. If you guys got more questions on the training aspect and want Brandon and I to shoot from the hip on different clients we utilize different training stuff with to get better examples, feel free to always ask us. We don't mind. Those kind of episodes are fun to us. We get to talk about what we're doing and how it applies and what we're doing with other stuff. So, but B, thanks for putting together a hell of a podcast. And guys, be sure to like it, share it, all that good stuff you guys can. We know that it's annoying to be peppered out there, but hey, if you guys just share it with one person a week, that will do us more help than sharing it all the time on your stories. Just make sure one person gets it in their hands every week. We'll grow faster. So we appreciate your help.
That is the ripple effect of both coaching as well as podcasting. If you guys can share something that has positively impacted you, you're able to positively impact and influence other people. And that's really why we've done so many of these in terms of our entire career. I've done hundreds of podcasts, as have you, and it really is making a positive influence on others.
Yep, 100%.
When it comes to where to find me, guys, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at @BrandonDeCruz_, as well as my email, which is bdecruzfitness@gmail.com. I just want to hit on this. Next week, we have a guest, a good friend of both of ours, Mr. Jeffrey Sue is going to be on the podcast. So we're looking forward to that. We're going to be interspersing some guest episodes going forward, especially in the month of May. So we have Jeffrey Sue up next week, as well as Jason Theobald 2 weeks from then. So we'll have, a week of a guest, then a week of us holding it down, and then another week of a guest, and we will go kind of in that format going forward. So guys, thank you so much for your support. Let us know any feedback that you have, as well as any guests that you may want us to have on. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm all for that. Just don't pick stupid guests that don't have really anything cool to talk about. They got to be very diverse and be able to have good talk conversations. No, man, we'll get requests, and then I'll go watch these people's socials. I'm there's no way I could get 15 minutes of conversation out of them. They only know one damn thing, and they only say one thing 42 different ways. So make sure it's good stuff that people could actually learn from when you guys suggest guests. And that's me being a dick from hosting a podcast for almost 4 years. We try, I always tell everybody you
can only extract so much from someone.
Be honest with you, the best episodes the Excellence Cartel has ever done, and same with when we had Alan on and Dr. Bill, it's where they just flow with us. You don't have to pull teeth to get information out of. Those are the ones that are hard, long podcasts to do. But you guys can find me, Jeff Unbreakable Black, on IG. My book can be bought at brittle-to-unbreakable.com. I'll be doing a pre-order soon. And then I'm on Relentless Forever on YouTube. Guys, I started doing a weekly contest prep. You get to see my gym, all the characters involved in the story.
Are you a vlogger now?
I'm doing all my stuff, dude. Yeah,
let's go.
I'll be honest, man. I got tired of I don't mind social media and all that, but sometimes I put together a keto video where I talked about 3 different cases of clients I utilize keto with their pictures, all different data. And I find that I'm enjoying the long form educational content more than the short form educational content of Instagram because I'm limited to 400 words and I talk better and write better than 400 words sometimes. And I'm not bad at wordsmithing. I just proved that with writing a book. You know, I mean, I can wordsmith,
Believe
but
me
there's
when I
just
say I can
something to
relate
be
to you
said. There's just
on
something to
this.
fucking be said about like, I want to be able to be like, no, like, look, this woman cried. She cried. She was like, fuck, I can't do this. I can't do that. And guess what? She pulled it together. We pulled it together and we did this. And then here's some of the results. And I want to be able to talk like that. And you can't always convey the emotional connection of the cases that the clients that we work on.
I agree 100%,
So
which is why my preferred platform are podcasts. And because I like that long form content. And I also really like being able to elaborate and expand on topics that are complex. And I'm trying to break them down and clarify them and simplify them in a manner. But sometimes we don't do them justice when they're in an Instagram caption.
So I'm going to tell you this in the audience, you guys can pepper them this. I've been doing those green screens, going over some of the different studies and stuff like that. I would encourage you to do some, Brandon, because of some of the studies that you know, some of the things you could spit in 90 seconds would be great for me to hear you talking like that in the video. And that's stuff that I think people would love to do it. Yeah, if you need help with them, let me know. Don't mind. But guys, thanks for tuning in. Share us. Keep pimping us out, loving us. We love you all. See y'all soon. Peace.
Peace.